March 2020, COVID-19 was declared a global pandemic by the World Health Organization. Offices shut, travel slowed down, the world moved inside. But development doesn't stop. As the world changed around us, the global development industry rapidly adapted to the new normal. From overcoming global supply chain disruptions to increasing access to remote learning, from jump-starting digital solutions to finding new ways to connect with the communities where we work. The cooperative, innovative, and resilient spirit of the global development industry ensures the progress, safety, and well-being of our global community. In challenging times, development works because we work together.
The future is coming, and it's coming at us faster than ever. The world is facing massive shifts, demographically, economically, politically. Shifts that are being amplified by the aftershocks of the COVID-19 pandemic and transforming life as we know it. Technologies are rising and converging to meet these challenges with new tools, new methods, new approaches to perennial problems. And as these forces converge, they are creating a new operating environment for the public sector, where government can draw from a vast and ever-changing array of technology enablers to address the demands of the moment, anticipating problems before they occur, adapting today's new realities, meeting the needs of citizens with resilient strategies that embrace the full potential of digital enablement. Find out what it takes to bring government into the future.
Greetings again, everyone. It's Roger Ford, your conference chair here live from SID conference headquarters in downtown Washington, D.C. Well, what an amazing and impactful 2 days. How have you liked our conference thus far? Our plenaries, panel sessions, network lounges have all been extremely busy, and I'm thrilled that you are all taking advantage of the many opportunities to learn, explore, and network. Can you believe we've had over 1,500 people attend the conference, representing over 60 countries around the globe? This wasn't possible in the old in-person format. And I really can't believe how quickly we're approaching the end of day 2. It's been amazingly enjoyable and truly impactful. And I wanted to take this opportunity to announce and talk about our innovation competition winners. Alexis Bonnell was our first judge. She was formerly the Chief Innovation Officer at USAID and now a Senior Executive at Google. Mervyn Farrow, Director for the Center for Development Innovation at USAID. And Jennifer Pham, Community Lead at Unleash. As you know, it was a very hard decision to try to figure out who was the innovation winner. But drum roll, please. In the people category, Vitalk, with its entry titled Promoting Mental Health and Resiliency. In the planet category, Chemonics, with its entry titled Smart Pollination in Plant Protection Services through Honeybees Cultivation. And in the prosperity category, the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery, with its entry titled Automated Decision Support Tool for Forced Labor Risk Detection. Congratulations to all of you for your excellent innovations. Our judges commented that they found all of the submissions exciting and compelling. The winners will be amplified through SID's social media channels and also featured in the SID newsletter. In addition to our judges, we asked all of you, our SID conference attendees, to check out the finalist entries and vote for their favorite. Thanks to all who have voted. I'm now pleased to announce that the Best in Show winner is in the category People, Devising New Ways to Learn Remotely, Intranet in an IDB Camp by Chemonics. Please congratulate them. And thanks again for all those who submitted truly outstanding entries, and to all of our judges for taking the time to look at them, and to all of you who have voted. If you haven't seen them yet, please stop by the Innovation Showcase in the Ideas Library. Like the rest of the content, it will be open and available to you for the next several weeks. Now for our annual conference platform points winner. As you know, for each activity you engaged in on our platform, like attending a panel or plenary, participating in a workshop, posting in our ideas library, visiting our exhibit hall, or going to our networking lounges, you gain points. It's been fun seeing the points add up over the last 2 days. We have one attendee who clearly was really enthusiastic about the conference and seems to have tried out every single feature because she garnered 1,200 points and is our winner. That's Ivy Akinyi from Kenya. She beat over 1,500 other attendees from over 60 countries. I'm not really sure Ivy really slept last night because she continued to rack up points long after our conference ended. Thank you for your enthusiasm, Ivy, and thank you for joining us from Kenya. We've been particularly pleased by the turnout from countries around the world, and in particularly those from developing countries. In fact, I think Kenya may have had the highest number of participants from any country outside the United States. Go Kenya. Please join me in congratulating all of our winners this year. It is innovations like these that will truly help us amplify impact and make meaningful progress towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And with that, let's shift gears and talk about our closing plenary, accelerating impact in the decade to deliver. Certainly, accelerating our impact is a critical topic given the theme of this year's conference and the critical work and challenges that lie ahead over the next decade in order to achieve the SDGs by 2030. And COVID-19 has only compounded these challenges. The impetus for accelerating impact topic and the plenary began with the SID member survey. Do you all remember that? It was back in February of this year. Seems like a decade ago when we received nearly 100 responses. An interdisciplinary team was then assembled. It consisted of Accenture, Brookings Institution, and SID leadership. We reviewed these results and then conducted a series of very comprehensive interviews with SID members and other global stakeholders to further qualify and expand on the findings. The results of this research and member survey were both revealing and surprising. Our institutional members and others working in international development are vital to advancing development, but must amplify their role and truly work together with the private sector, government, and donors if we are to achieve the SDG objectives by 2030. Another amazing result. While 3 out of 4 governments and 2 out of 3 companies measure their progress against the SDGs, surprisingly, only 1 in 4 of us, implementers and NGOs, do so as well. Aligning strategically to the SDGs will enable our international development community to be more responsible, accelerate our performance, and gain influence. Finally, further, as we seek to continue to deepen our partnerships with the private sector, the SDGs can provide a consistent language to drive and expand impact programming, and they provide a common framework for implementers to partner, measure, and articulate shared value with all stakeholder groups. With these findings in hand, Accenture has published a report entitled Accelerating Impact in the Decade to Deliver, which examines the research and provides a roadmap and actions that international development implementers and NGOs can take to assume the driver's seat in the decade to deliver. You can find a link to the report by viewing the details of this plenary. I would now like to turn the floor over to George Ingram, Senior Fellow, Global Economy and Development at the Brookings Institution. George has an extensive professional career in Congress, the executive branch, and the nonprofit sector, where he has focused on international economic and development policy. He is a senior fellow in the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institution. He also serves as the chair emeritus of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition and is co-chair of the Modernizing Foreign Assistance Network. George has also assembled a distinguished panel of experts to examine this topic further. With that, George, over to you.
Thank you, Roger. Good afternoon, everyone. I've had the pleasure to collaborate, engage with the SID Secretariat and the Conference Planning Committee on the survey. I'm going to hit on a few of the highlights of the report that Roger mentioned, which will frame our conversation today. I will then introduce the panel and start a conversation with the panel. 98 SID members participated in the survey. 1/2 of the membership reported that their organizations implement SDGs through their programs. 1/3 reported they embed SDGs in their corporate behavior, internal operations. Less than 1/4 report that they strategically measure their impact on the SDGs. These findings are in the broader context in which 3/4 of the countries of the world have completed voluntary national reviews of their commitments to the SDGs. Cities and corporations are stepping up to embrace the SDGs. A recent survey of corporate CEOs reported that 2/3 have metrics to track their contributions to the SDGs. And finally, a decline from corporations and how they expect to engage with NGOs in dealing with development and the SDGs. And finally, the report provides the methodologies for organizations to use so they can embrace the SDGs in their operations and in their programs. We are fortunate to have with us today a panel of diverse experts on these issues. First of all, Tessie San Martin is President and CEO of Plan International USA. Her career has crossed the range of development issues, both in the private sector and in the NGO sector. Tessie co-chairs the Modernizing Foreign Assistance Network and is noted for leading Plan and the community on key aspects of making assistance more effective, particularly localization, accountability, and committing Plan to transparency under the International Aid Transparency Initiative. Sarah Mendelson is Professor of Public Policy at the Heinz College at Carnegie Mellon University. In her prior life, she was U.S. Representative to UN ECOSOC. She is a noted scholar and practitioner, particularly in democracy and human rights. Shaun Mickus is Senior Director for Local Community Impact and Global Community Impact at Johnson & Johnson. His title says it all. He has what this audience might call the development position at J&J. He has led the company into being an early corporate leader on commitments to sustainability, ESG principles, the MDGs, and now the SDGs. Eric Redding is Division Vice President for International Development at Apt Associates. Eric has expertise and experience in a range of development issues and is recognized as a leader in the development community and in an organization that is noted for deep technical expertise in health, particularly healthcare systems, the critical importance of which is made starkly clear by COVID-19. To start, we're going to do 3 rounds of questioning. The first round is going to focus on how organizations are using the SDGs in their programming. And the second round is going to focus on how they use them on their internal operations. And the third is going to look at metrics. Tessie, I'd like to start with you. As I noted in my introduction, Plan really has been at the head of the pack on key elements of development, which is advocating for localization and gender approaches. As noted in the report on the SID survey, NGOs are not at the forefront in strategically and consciously advancing the SDGs in their programs and in their activities. Why is a community that is known for advocating for the SDGs not embracing them in their strategies and programs? What is the situation with Plan? What would it take for Plan and other NGOs to use the SDGs more strategically?
Wow, George. Thanks for those softball questions to get us started. I've got some theories as to what's been driving sort of the lack of engagement with SDGs, just based on our own experience at Plan. So let me give you those first, and then I'll turn into sort of the last part of it is what might it take to change that. You asked a question, right, about INGOs embracing the SDGs in their strategies and programs. And I think the answer to that, to the question of why that's not happening, starts with, well, what has been the role of strategy at INGOs? And I don't know if you recall, or others in the virtual audience here, there was a report that came out in 2013 by FSG. They interviewed about 50 INGOs, and that report noted a bunch of things, but one of them was that less than 39% of the NGOs, and it really was all the major ones, less than 39% of them had any kind of a strategic planning function. So I guess observation number one is, strategy is not a long-held tradition in INGOs. And I saw that at Plan. When I came to Plan, Plan International had a strategy, but frankly, it was a strategy that was around what we call in the INGO world resource mobilization, or getting money, and so it had ambitions around resources that we were going to mobilize to support the broad mission of the organization, which was children's rights, but it wasn't necessarily a deliberate programmatic strategy. About 5 years ago, we really did develop together, and now Plan is an organization that's in 70 countries, working with 40 million children, 11,000 employees. So getting everybody in that large collective to agree to a strategy was not an easy thing, but it was done, and we aligned around gender equality and girls' rights. And I have to say that when we did that, it was not without trauma, and which had to do with, if you have a strategy, then you need to make choices. And that meant, for example, at Plan, we had several members that were really big in water, sanitation, and hygiene. It was, oh my gosh, now we're going to do gender equality. Where does that fit? Does that fit at all? Is it as important as it was? And so first of all, it really is a question of strategy, and having strategies that are more than just about resource mobilization, but really about impact and transformation. And once you embrace that, then I think, for us, the SDGs were hugely helpful in terms of aligning that large collective. I think there's a second reason, though, and that has to do with donor interest. And frankly, most of us here in this room, not for Plan, but I think many here in this room, the US government is a major donor. It accounts for a big chunk of everybody's resources on an annual basis. And the US government has been anywhere from sort of interested, mildly interested, indifferent to, outright hostile to SDGs. And so if the main donor is less interested, clearly that what's going to follow is that the rest of the entities may not be embracing it. If the donor hasn't made it clear how these feature and what part, how they feature in program impact, then it's likely that those receiving money from the donor will not. One of the interesting things about the Accenture report is that it's noting that for private donors, and we've noticed that it really is important to the extent that there's an increase in diversification of donor base, a funding base, we may see more of that. I think one last element really has to do with metrics, right? What gets measured gets done. I think metrics for SDGs have been really improving, and so I'm hoping that that too will further incent. I think there's at this point you could also say there is an element of resources, and that leads me to a quick answer to your last question. What might it take to get more in the community sort of embracing that as an integral part of the strategy? I think one of them is economic pressure. As I said, strategy is about choices. Resource constraints means you have to start making choices because you might not be able to do everything, and so you have to be, more disciplined. So I think that's one element that's really going to drive it. The second one, as I said, is donor interest. To the extent that private donors are more important, and this is more important, then we could see a big change. If we have a change in administration, we could see a big change. And thirdly, I do think there's been better metrics on SDG. One last thing I'll say. Support for SDGs, embracing SDGs, measurement of SDGs as an organizing principle, in my opinion, has never been more important than it is right now. Why? Because we're facing, right, over the last 6 months, we've had gigantic setbacks in terms of the progress made on SDGs over the last 10 years. So if we're not focused and concerted right now, we don't have a prayer to reach those SDGs anytime before the end of this, the end of the next, 50, 80 years. So I think it's never been more important. So let me leave it at that.
Great. Thank you, Tessie. Eric, the SID survey covered the entire SID community. So let's bring this conversation into development contractors. What's the situation at APT? What's the situation with development contractors? And have you, with your colleagues, either in APT or in the broader community, had conversations and thoughts about what it would take to bring the SDGs into your strategies and programs? My guess is particularly one of Tessie's comments will resonate with you because basically what she said is money talks.
Yeah, not only does money talk, but where you're working matters. APT works, for example, in APT Australia, which is a big part of our business, and APT UK, where the SDGs are very much forward as part of the conversation in how we develop our programming, how we talk about ourselves, how we measure ourselves. But as Tessie noted, in the US, it has not been part of the dialogue. It's not been part of the dialogue at all for the past 3 years and never really got going in that way. But as we look to our forward strategy and as we've talked about the identity of APT for the next years to come, the SDGs are very different from their predecessors in the MDGs in that they're designed to be a normative framework for how a society functions well. And that normative framework is just as relevant in the United States as it is in Uganda or in Bangladesh or anywhere else. And what we find when we look across APT and we look at how we identify ourselves going forward, how we measure ourselves going forward, is that even our domestic clients, like the New York City Department of Public Health, are talking about the SDGs. New York City has a a plan to achieve the SDGs and a strategy against that, and talks about it in those terms. So as we look across all of APT, we look at the work that we do in health, we look at the work that we do in agriculture, education, or other areas. All of that is encapsulated by the SDGs, and it really helps define who we are, how we develop that self-identity, and how we measure ourselves across both the domestic and international practice and the parts of the international practice that are funded by different development agencies. So while it's been a forbidden topic in the realm of the U.S. government for the past few years, I think a lot of us see that likely to change. And I think the way that we talk about the SDGs, the way that all of our organizations use the SDGs as frames to measure ourselves, and as Tessie mentioned, what gets measured gets done. And if you're defining yourself and measuring yourself in that way, all of us collectively as a community are going to be far more effective at helping to be that catalyst that moves the SDGs forward, whether that's moving it forward in our own countries or it's moving it forward in the countries where we do our programmatic work abroad.
Great. Thanks, Eric. Shaun, your company, Johnson & Johnson, has been a leader in committing to the SDGs. Before that, the MDGs. And specifically, Johnson & Johnson has committed to SDG 3 on good health and well-being, SDG 5 on gender equality, and SDG 17 on partnerships. But Johnson & Johnson is not the only multinational that's committed and is using the SDGs. Why are they doing that? Why are they engaging? Why is Johnson & Johnson engaging with the SDGs? And specifically, address the issue that I heard a lot when I looked at this a few years ago, that the SDGs provide a common language. What's that about, and what did the SDGs hold for you, Brett, J&J?
Yeah, great. Thank you, George. Appreciate the questions here and the panelists and their perspectives. You know, you're right. I think the SDGs do offer, for the first time, that comprehensive framework, a common lexicon, if you will, for identifying and addressing issues of importance for the world community. And, you know, this framework really provides that call to action for, you know, all global actors to participate in a way that's meaningful for them and to help address the goals and the targets. So it's no surprise that many companies have embraced them and tried to incorporate them into their business models and their strategies. As you said, J&J was one of the early companies to put forth an initial commitment, initial 5-year commitment, and that really followed on the heels of our MDG commitment. And you know, our senior manager saying, "Okay, what's next?" And we said, "Well, the SDGs are here. What are they?" And so we had that conversation, and that led then into us kind of going through a goal setting process and looking at you know, the framework and, you know, our existing long-standing, what we call health for humanity goals that we set every 5 years. We've been doing that for almost 3 decades, and they cover a lot of topics in the ESG space. So, you know, we initially looked at the SDG framework as additive and, you know, as a complement to some things we were already doing and thinking about. And so we had a lot of deliberation about that within the company, and ultimately landed on the 3 SDGs that you referenced, as well as 5 commitment areas where we believe that we could have a meaningful impact based on, you know, past work, existing portfolios, new work coming on board, and alignment to our core businesses. And those 5 areas address global disease challenges, health workforce development, essential surgery, women and children's health, and environmental health. And you know, so yeah, we formally report out, and I know we'll talk a little bit more about measurement and evaluation on this panel, but we formally report out on our progress every year in our Health for Humanity annual report. We have a dashboard on our website where you see transparently our progress. And our current commitment concludes at the end of 2020, and we'll be making another announcement in the early part of next year for our next set of goals. And they'll certainly be even more comprehensive than before, and they'll be packaged within our Health for Humanity kind of framework, where we'll have specific SDG targets tied to all of our goals that we'll put forward.
Thank you, Shaun. Sarah, let's talk about 17 rooms, or 17 Zooms, as they're now called, that Brookings and the Rockefeller Foundation have been engaged in for several years of trying to convene, bringing conversations around the 17 SDGs. You have been actively engaged in the project, co-moderating Zoom 16 on peace, justice, and strong institutions, along with your co-chair, Nancy Limborg. Help us understand the purpose of the 17 rooms exercise, and specifically, give us an idea of what's come out of room 16.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much, George. Well, the 17 rooms exercise is incredibly adaptive, and it can be used in lots of different contexts. We adapted it at Carnegie Mellon to be able to elicit information and grow awareness about the SDGs. But the way that Brookings and Rockefeller initially engaged in it has really evolved. In 2018, it really felt like an exercise of community building, but also sort of encouraging those of us who were committed to the SDGs to have a space to be able to come and discuss. In 2019, we began to mix it up a little bit more. We were thrown into other rooms and understanding what the connections were. But really, actually, in 2020, in some ways, I think it's beginning to really crystallize, right? So we've had a number of meetings over many months, June, July, August, September. And we've come up with very specific priorities, each room, that we are committed to through the end of December 2021, right? So it's gotten us much more focused. And because it was much more iterative this time, I think that there's even more of a community. Specifically, what came out of room 16 we had 4 priorities. One is about #JustRecovery. This is a global rallying cry targeted at the $20 trillion in COVID relief and recovery packages. And I'll talk a little bit more about it in a second, because I think there's lots of interest from other rooms that Rockefeller and Brookings convened. We really see the SDGs as a paradigm shift, both in how we understand sustainability as being well beyond the environment and really about justice, but also a paradigm shift in terms of development, that development happens everywhere, including in the United States. Therefore, our second priority is about applying international justice standards applied domestically. And there were 2 particular areas that we were focused on. One are standards regarding the use of force, particularly around policing, that the United States is not in alignment with the international standards on the use of force and policing. And the second is really reanimating transitional justice, reanimating ways in which countries, societies address grievances from the past, that how you reconcile with violent episodes of the past is a driver of development. Can we take the lessons learned from the menu of transitional justice that has been applied around the world and use it in the United States? The third priority, very briefly, we want to create a community of practice to grow the next generation of human rights and social justice experts. And so this is about teaching and training human rights differently using the SDGs. And then fourth, it's an elevation of prevention work. Fragility is gaining ground everywhere. This had a particular focus on widening the aperture to enable a longer cycle of work with people in the process, including youth and women, really trying to up our game in terms of how prevention. So those were our 4 priorities in room 16.
Sarah, let me continue on this. I've been participating in room 12 on responsible consumption and production. And what has really struck me is where that room has gone is to focus on the circular economy and waste. And in dealing with those issues, they are integrated with 10 of the other SDGs. What comes out of these conversations is that the SDGs aren't standalone, they're integrated. I assume that's the case with Room 17, and give us a couple of examples of that.
So for Room 16, we think of this in a lot of ways, and we think of it as the 16 plus agenda, how you create peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. And core to that is reducing inequality. So we were not surprised that our colleagues from Room 10, which is about reducing inequality, were really taken with our #JustRecovery effort. And let me just say a little bit more about this. We're talking about an approach that applies traditional supply side governance models with a demand side data-driven model that begins by identifying what people's needs are in a locality and then empowers citizens, civil society, and the private sector and others to shape and trace the financial flows, right? So we're talking about shaping how these recovery and relief packages are done, but also tracing the money. And a particular emphasis would be on data collection of justice needs. So I think both Room 10 on reducing inequality was very interested in this effort. Our colleagues in Room 13 around climate action also see this as very critical. They want to make sure that there's a justice capacity involved in the climate response. And then, of course, I think there's a big crosswalk with Room 5 and reducing gender inequality.
Thanks, Sarah. Let's go to the second topic now, and I'll start out again with Tessie. The survey found that NGOs are not using, for the most part, the SDGs in a second way, embedding them in their internal operations behavior. Why is this, and what's the opportunity here? What would be the opportunity?
Okay, well, so again, really interesting question, George. Thank you. And have really enjoyed the rest of the panel's observations. I guess from my perspective, and again, you can imagine, so an organization like Plan gets all aligned around gender equality and girls' rights. We're speaking about it loudly and often. It very quickly became very obvious that you need to then do more than a bit of self-examination, right, to make sure that you're really walking the talk. Otherwise, it starts to look like, well, so this is fine for somebody else, but not for me. And to I think Sarah's point, I mean, the thing about SDGs, one of many things about the SDGs is their universality. They really do apply to everyone and everything. It's not just something that we're doing to somebody else. So we actually started on this journey doing and it's not by any means complete. So we started with what we called a gender equality self-assessment. And it was a biennial process that every part of Plan did. And it really was actually very telling because it revealed a number of, implicit, explicit biases in a lot of policies around, how we hired, how we operated, how we went to market, how we talked about our work, and we began to address it. At the end of last year, however, we took it further and we said, okay, so the self-assessment is good, but it has to be focused on more than just gender, because this journey that we're on is really more about sort of a broader inclusion effort, right? Because that is what this whole effort is about, is about inclusion and equality. So we actually then commissioned an external consultant to do a benchmarking exercise, and it looked at a bunch of our practices around programming, but also operations, and it compared us to our peers and against some standards in terms of best practices, in terms of what did it really mean to be, to apply diversity, equity, inclusion principles, across the board. And what we found was telling and a little shocking. So what we found was that so we were actually very highly rated, at the top or number two, when it came to programming, right? So we had really embraced, gender equality, DEI in our programming and in every bit of how we went around sort of designing, executing, monitoring, evaluating our programs. What was missing was applying that to our operations. In fact, when you looked at our operations, we were no longer at the top. We were all the way at the bottom. And so, in fact, we've embarked now on a more ambitious process to really look at every part of our operation. By the way, starting with and including our governance, our board of directors, their operations, how they recruit, how they onboard, various elements like that, and looking at every part of our operation. And honestly, it hasn't necessarily been an easy journey. And in an environment of constrained resources, it's also been difficult because we all know the circumstances that we're facing. But I felt certainly, and I think we all felt that it was a gigantic risk to the organization to not be able to live what you were espousing in your programs. Right? It's very easy to say, well, this applies to somebody else. Looking in the mirror and thinking about how you need to transform yourself before you start talking about transforming others is what actually needs to be happening. So I would say that this internal journey for Plan has been a good one, if at times somewhat painful. And I have to say that I think it's something that we all need to be thinking about, embracing. We can't be talking about SDGs is not what applies to others, it's what applies to all of us. And it should be applied to all of us in our totality, not just some elements of it. And that, I believe, at the end of the day, will enable more effective and sustainable programming as well.
Tessie, thank you for demonstrating your reputation for transparency and honesty. And I think the other point I get from you is maybe all 17 SDGs don't apply to a particular organization, but you find one or two or three of them that are particularly relevant to you, and you drill down in that direction. Eric,
yes.
So let's turn to the same issue with the development contractors. To what extent can the SDGs serve as a benchmark for internal behavior, or the way you organize, the way you conduct business? What's the situation there?
Yeah, this is a very interesting area, and I think evolving quickly, because APT has been an organization that's been really committed to the principles that we now call the Sustainable Development Goals since it was founded in the early 60s. And has put a lot of effort over the years into things like environmental and social governance, where we measure the kinds of things that Tessie was referring to of our internal operations, and have a strong commitment to making those as sustainable and as consistent with the SDGs as possible. So that made it very easy when the SDGs were introduced, and then the SDG Global Compact became something that allowed businesses to engage with the UN around the SDGs on their commitment to living according to those principles. APT made a very easy decision to join that SDG Global Compact and embedded it in what we do to look at our own operations in terms of what is the environmental impact, what is the social impact, what are other things. And we try to go further than that as well. We've, for example, in the area of gender equity, which is critically important to us, we've achieved an EDGE certification, which is a global certification to recognize gender equity in your internal operations across the organization. But we've also found it very, very interesting as we've engaged in this journey with the SDGs and with the UN around our internal operations, as well as to the extent that we can with our programmatic work, that this really forms a common language between us and the business community. As many of you know, APT has been involved in private sector engagement for a long time, and particularly in the health space. How the private sector engages with health is something that's really critical to us. And we find that organizations just like J&J and many others The private sector is already talking in terms of the SDGs. They're talking about it in terms of the preventing the negative impacts that a company can have in terms of environmental and social governance. They're talking about it in terms of the positive impact that a company's products and services can have in terms of how they move forward. And that spectrum is providing a really common language around impact that's very, very useful in engaging between the development community and the private sector. I've been involved quite a bit in the space of impact investing over the past couple of years. And I think this is a place where you're really seeing that fusion and that common language between the development community and the private sector around the SDGs happening very, very quickly. Even though we in the development community and those of us who are more associated with the government are talking less about the SDGs, if you're on Wall Street, it is the vocabulary that's being used in the community around impact investment, around social and environmental impact that's being sought out in that space. And we find that when we do a program like the Investing in Women program that we're focusing on in Asia, the actors that we're engaging with in setting up a private equity fund to be able to invest in women-owned, women-controlled businesses are talking about SDG 5. They're committed to SDG 5. So as we partner with a PE fund that invests in the work that we're doing, as we partner with investment banks who are helping to leverage the capital that these funds are bringing forward, that conversation around the SDGs is really critical to them, and they're framing and measuring their work in terms of the SDGs. So I think that common vocabulary of the SDGs across a lot of things that we've talked about very separately, which include development impact in our space, environmental and social governance and kind of mainstream business, in the space of positive impact and companies really describing how they're making a positive impact through their products and services. And even in the capital markets and the capital community, that whole spectrum is using the SDGs as a common language. And I think the fusion of that coming together is really interesting. And that's what we're seeing at APT, that the work that we've done internally on those internal operations spaces are really melding with what we're doing programmatically. And I think that's a fascinating fusion that the SDGs is causing across all of our communities.
Eric, while you've got the microphone, very quickly, a question came in that you mentioned Australia and the UK is focusing on the SDGs. Is that because of donor requirements? And really just a real quick answer.
Yeah, I don't know that it's because of donor requirements. It's just because it's embedded in the donor vocabulary. The donors, were involved in creating the SDGs. So organizations like DFAT, DFID, USAID were very much in the conversation when the SDGs were created and were bought into it. The US, as we all know, has really walked back from multilateralism, has walked back from anything global. So the US government has not really engaged in the vocabulary over the past few years. But it is very much central to the vocabulary of the government of Australia, the government of UK, and others. As we look at other governments around the world, the SDGs are at the forefront of how we talk about development.
Thanks, Eric. Sarah, I'd like for you to give us a snapshot of something very unique at Carnegie Mellon. Nations are doing voluntary national reviews. Cities are starting to do reviews. You've been part of a team taking Carnegie through a voluntary university review. And I know you've been involved beyond the university. So as you answer this question and give us a sense of what has happened at Carnegie Mellon, a question came in, why do you think the SDGs haven't been much of a focus in the US? And you've been involved below the national level, at the city level, at the state level. So give us a little bit of sense there too.
Sure. Stepping back 1 second, you can ask, well, why the SDGs in general? Carnegie Mellon has a history over the last 20 years of working a lot on sustainability in the environmental context. We had a change of leadership in 2018 and 2019, a new president of the university and a new provost. And the provost began early in his tenure to be thinking about what more could we be doing about sustainability. And there were a lot of us, faculty, students, staff, suggesting things. And I was an advocate for the SDGs at Carnegie Mellon, and we came up with this idea of having a steering committee that meets weekly and reports to the provost, an advisory council that meets monthly, but more specifically to have a series of charges. Number one, grow awareness of the SDGs across the university, elevate the university's engagement with the SDGs, oversee a process of community engagement known as the Voluntary University Review, develop processes to identify priority opportunities for the university, advise on strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and challenges, and communicate to the university and the larger world. And we did this in part because, as others have noted, Eric in particular, how countries and cities talk about, how the world talks about the SDGs is through voluntary reviews. And so we decided we wanted to do one of those as well. And then we decided it would be a good idea to hire the person who came up with the idea of a voluntary local review, Alexandra Hineker, from New York City to help us do this at Carnegie Mellon. So she is very much a part of the team. We found and believed that the role of universities in educating the next generation, what I call cohort 2030, of development experts who are going to work domestically and overseas was fundamental to our mission, right? So the role of universities, well, maybe the CEOs in the paper didn't think there was much role for academia. Academia increasingly sees itself as having a big role, right? So we have a lot of universities around the world that are interested in how we did this. Of course, we work very closely with colleagues in the city of Pittsburgh. The mayor has committed to doing a voluntary local review. Our provost was just on a panel convened by Brookings and the UN Foundation, along with representatives from New York City, LA, Hawaii, both at the governor level and the senator from Hawaii. So it is the case that at the federal level, there has not been a lot of activity in the United States, but within cities and states, there's been a lot of activity. That will continue regardless of what happens in November. But I do agree, if there's a change in administration, you can imagine that there'll be much more engagement around the SDGs, certainly on the bilateral and multilateral effort, and certainly at AID. But I think it's also important to continue to grow what has been an organic effort inside different communities in the United States. People see the value add of the SDGs for all the reasons that we've been talking about. And so that's been exciting. And you know, we have an iterative process here in how we align our education, our research, and practice with the SDGs. But we're really excited to have done this first initial voluntary university review.
So we are pressed for time, but I want to get to this third issue on metrics because it's so important, and there's been so much confusion around it. I'm going to ask Shaun to address it first because the corporate community has really been out front on this issue. Jay Nelson wrote an article a few years ago that noted there were over 200 different systems of metrics, and it confused the corporate community on ESG and SDGs. They didn't know what to do. The Economist this week had an article that said there's something like 360 systems. And the four big accounting firms are trying to come together around a common system. Shaun, tell us about, and take a few minutes, tell us about how J&J uses metrics and how those of us on the outside can read your reports and have confidence in those metrics.
Sure. Well, you know, this is the ongoing, I think, opportunity for the SDGs is really measurement and evaluation. I can tell you at Johnson & Johnson, M&E, as we call it, you know, it's core to who we are. And so from my vantage point, you know, any effort in the marketplace to help align on common sets of metrics is absolutely welcome. And as you noted, you know, there are a number of groups kind of looking at this and making some progress there. You know, my group has, you know, on board, you know, 2 M&E experts, and they really drive our M&E agenda for our SDG commitment and other efforts across our group. And, you know, in the business context, and I I know this has come up a couple times, however you want to say it, but, we think about it as you can't manage what you can't or don't measure. And so for us, we've been at this for a while and still learning, but we have a pretty sophisticated tracking effort in place with our partners to not only collect data, to roll it up, to analyze it, and then importantly, before we publish it, to have it externally validated by an independent group. And, a lot of this is really built on when we think about it at the start point of any larger engagement that we'll do with partners to co-create, theory of change models, because I think that's the starting point. Where do you want to end up? And then let's work backwards from there to figure out a plan to get there. And then let's measure it along the way and do some course correcting as we need to. So, beyond this happening within our SDG commitment, it happens in our broader set of health for humanity goals that I mentioned earlier, which go beyond the SDGs. It's hard work. It's essential for tracking our progress. Stakeholders are asking questions and they deserve answers on them. And, it gives us the opportunity to continuously improve.
Independent benchmarking request do you get a year, and how many do you respond to?
I'm sorry, George, I didn't hear that question.
There are over 300 systems out there, and corporations are getting bombarded every year by various reporting benchmarking operations on various aspects of your operations. How many of those do you get sent to you every year, and how many do you respond to?
Yeah, well, I'm certainly not our resident expert on that. There are other people in our shop who deal with that, so I can't give you specific numbers. I can tell you, though, we do get many, many requests, and they can be overwhelming. So I know that the team who manages those requests, they have an approach to prioritize them coming in and address the ones that are going to have the most impact, because we can't answer them all. It's impossible to do that. We would be spending days and nights doing that, taking away from our day jobs trying to serve patients around the world.
All right, let's move the question to the other three panelists, starting with Sarah and then Eric and Tessie. And Sarah, what metrics are you all using to measure what's come out of your voluntary assessment?
So we've done a number of things. These are, of course, the pandemic hit in March when we were really just gearing up to do a lot of work. We held a 17 Zooms exercise in the first 2 weeks of May that really elicited a lot of hidden connections. We found people working on similar issues but didn't know one another. It's a large university, it's not surprising, but it was very helpful. We've scraped through the course selections to understand which courses align with different SDGs. We're using a beta version of something called Dimensions to look at research and how the university's many publications align. And then we have lots of different ways of capturing practice, which is where a lot of the sustainability action has lived. But it's imperfect. We are very much in the space of thinking about how to create systems that more systematically capture the information rather than inputting by hand. We have over 400 student organizations, for example, in understanding how they all engage with the SDGs. So we're still early days. We had to start somewhere. We have to have a landscaping and understand what percentage of whatever SDG is being taught. But we're very excited about creating new and better information systems that can be used by our university and other universities. And happy to talk to any colleagues who are listening who want to know more. Thanks.
Thank you. Eric.
So for us, I'd say that the internal tracking is incredibly frustrating for an organization that is very, very evidence-driven and committed to data-based decisions, because it is so fragmented. And, we have worked very hard to try to accumulate this together in what we call our mission impact reports. But we are looking at very dissimilar data both for those negative impacts in the ESG space and the positive impacts that we're making in the work that we do. But I think that we are seeing this cohesion coming together at light speed right now. And if you haven't been paying attention in the past year to this space of ESG and impact measurement, you should be, because it's really coming together quickly. And a lot of it started last year in August when Jamie Dimon and the Business Roundtable announced a redefinition of the corporation based on stakeholders and not shareholders. And those stakeholders include not only the shareholders of the corporation, but the community that the corporation exists in, as well as the planet itself. And that has really kicked off a lot of conversations that have gone through a trajectory, even despite COVID, through Davos and then this most recent UN General Assembly. There's a really important date that happened that probably slipped by most people because it's incredibly nerdy in this space. But September 11th, 2020 was not as significant for the 19th anniversary of September 11th as it was for the fact that two enormous announcements happened in the space of impact measurement. First, an organization that you probably don't know about, but the control of your organization probably does. The International Federation of Accountants made a formal recommendation to IFRS, which controls the international accounting standards, of which the US GAAP is associated with, that impact measures be formally integrated into mandatory financial disclosures. And that's a really big deal because every recommendation that's come through the International Federation of Accountants to IFRS has ultimately been adopted. So that's a big deal. The same day that happened, the 8 largest organizations who have systems for measuring impact in corporate social, in ESG, came together in something that was facilitated by the big 4 accounting firms, if this is what you're referring to, George, around a common framework that their 8 different measurement systems can actually be integrated into one. And that's led to a lot of momentum over the past few weeks that's really looking at how can the impact of organizations be disclosed and be consistently measured in ways that are we're able to assess what is that impact, both the negative impact and the positive impact, just as we are in terms of comparable financial statements. And today, the regulator of the accounting systems and corporations in the United Kingdom actually made the recommendation themselves that impact measures be embedded as mandatory within financial statements. So how this actually gets embedded, how it plays out, remains to be seen. And it's likely to happen over 3-5 years. But I think that the way that we measure impact is evolving very quickly. It's evolving much faster in the business community, as Shaun and George talked about, than it is in the development community, but it is aligning around the SDGs. And the SDGs is that common vocabulary that is allowing us to measure impact in a more and more cohesive way. And that is an enormous positive for industry, for the planet, for everything else. And I think it's something we really need to be hopeful for going forward.
Eric, thanks for that updated information. That's very important, very encouraging, and very important. Thanks. Tessie, for you to wrap up this part of the conversation.
Well, first of all, fascinated to hear what Eric was talking about, and Shaun as well, because we all benefit, obviously, from more robust, aligned, consistent measuring systems. Because in the absence of that, we're kind of all sort of doing, our own thing. Plan has aligned around, gender equality, SDG 5, and related measures. And it's been sort of a very useful construct to align what is really a decentralized organization, and give everybody some clear objectives. That being said, we are not, we have some rudimentary measures that everybody can align by. We're now more consistent in terms of how we define our programming as gender transformative, how we measure, compliance with that, how we measure progress to that. But we've got a long way to go. And as I listen to Eric, I get very excited, but I'm also sort of reminded that, some years ago, the charity navigators and other charity rating agencies said, we're gonna not just measure overhead and other financial measures for charities, for NGOs, we're now also gonna measure impact. Well, gosh, we're not quite there yet, and it's been a while. So what I'm saying is it is complicated. Having a lot of really smart people think about it is important. Now that's on the internal side. I have to say, one of the things that Plan has also been investing in to support the broader community effort around SDGs is investing in improving the measurement and the progress in the SDGs themselves. So, for example, we have we're one of the founders, along with Gates and others, in the founding of an entity called Equal Measures 2030. Equal Measures 2030 was developed precisely in recognition of the fact that data on gender and gender equality are very poor around the world. So how were we going to know what progress we were making if we didn't have good data in that regard? Equal Measures 2030 has created, a very highly regarded gender equality index, a gender index, to measure the state of gender equality through through a number of measures in 129 countries, and so that then begins to give all of us that common language that we've been talking about. KPMG, by the way, is part of Equal Measures 2030. And one other sort of element, and George, this because we're both, we both are part of the U.S. Board of Publish What You Fund, but a Plan, along with Save the Children, has invested along with the Gates Foundation in improving data, right, to understand donor investments in gender equality. And that, to me, the fact that we had to really sort of invest in really understanding where donors were investing and how they were investing in gender equality is a step, I think, to then understand what's working and what isn't. So all to say that we need much more investment in this area, and it is something in which every member of our community can be contributing, because I don't think it gets solved by one or two organizations. It's going to require really crowdsourcing the best of all of us to think through how we measure our own progress and how we measure the community's progress on SDGs. But it's never been more important.
Tessie, just in the last month, I have discovered Equal Measures 2030 for a paper I'm writing, and glad to know that you were involved in that creation. It's a very valuable source of information. We have outlived our time. We've gone over by 5 or so minutes. So as I move this panel back, or move the microphone back to Roger, I want to do two things. One, I want to urge the audience to take a look at the report, Accelerating Impact in the Decade to Deliver. It is a very useful guide. It's a good analysis, and particularly the methodology at the end is something that can help guide organizations as they try to go through their own assessment. My sincere thanks to Sarah, Shaun, Eric, Tessie for a robust conversation. And to the audience, I wish there was a way you could applaud the audience, but I know you're out there thanking them for a great conversation. Roger, over to you.
Thank you, George. What an amazing panel. Thank you to all the panelists on the Accelerating Impact topic. It was an amazing, great dialogue, rich discussions, and what a great way to leave the day. I hope we can put some of these recommendations and ideas into practice, and perhaps we can reflect back on them maybe next year at the next annual conference. But now the time has truly come to a close for this year's conference. As I noted at our kickoff yesterday, this has absolutely been an extraordinary year to try and plan and deliver a virtual conference when no real roadmap existed. But it's been an absolute privilege to serve as the chair. I personally want to thank Melissa Logan of Chemonics and SID-Washington's former board chair for appointing me this year. I used to say, was this the short straw? But it turned out to be the best straw. I'd also like to thank all of our presenters, panelists, and moderators that participated in this year's conference. We wouldn't have a conference without you. Your amazing international development experience and your ability to be resilient and innovative despite the harsh realities and challenges of COVID-19 are truly amazing. You brought these experiences to life, to our community, and that's what's truly and critically important if we're going to make true progress against the SDGs. Next, I want to again thank the entire SID organization, including Catherine Ray-Fulson, SID's president, the entire SID staff, our terrific board, and most of all, my fellow committee members, including Wade Warren, Ann Simmons-Benton, Ann Huddick, Mark Johnson, and Carla Koppel. We truly could not have done it without you. I would also like to thank all of our sponsors who have shown unwavering support of SID and our development community during these unprecedented times. Over the last 2 days, we've covered a lot of ground, and it was great to meet so many of you, albeit virtually. The technology worked almost flawlessly, and I want to thank the Tech Change team for their great support throughout this process. Over the months ahead, there will be plenty of dialogue and programming through SID-Washington on the SDGs, the impact of COVID, and the ongoing virtualization of development programs. We look forward to collaborating with all of you to drive impact together in the decade to deliver. Congrats again. Thanks to everyone across the community for the impact you deliver every day around the world. Goodbye and stay safe.